webinar is brought to you by the AILA Victoria Environment Committee. My name is Brendon Burke and I'll be today's host. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting from today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, including any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching this webinar. Regarding Q&A, as part of this webinar, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. Feel free to post any questions you may have throughout the presentations, and we will have a short Q&A session at the end, where I will direct these questions to the relevant speakers. So today's event is the next in the series based on the themes of exploring vegetation selection for a changing climate. As we experience increasing temperatures and frequent climatic anomalies, do we need to start shifting our mindsets when we design to restore landscapes? How do we resolve tensions between restoring landscapes to pre-white settlement conditions and the reality of shifting climate zones that may no longer support the plant communities of 1788? What of urban landscapes as we strive to establish resilience and maximize biodiversity? This online webinar will explore these questions, drawing on the presenters' expertise in bushfire ecology and forest restoration, Indigenous plant establishment and selection of replacement species for commercialization. Philosophical and practical issues of plant selection will be addressed. So first up, we have Tom Fairman. Tom is a forester who works in forest and fire ecology at the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He completed his PhD in forest ecology in 2019, focusing on the impact of short interval severe wildfires on temperate eucalypt forests. He has previously undertaken research on the carbon dynamics of native forests and the ecosystem services of urban forests. His main research interests relate to the role of fire in native forests, with a focus on shifting fire regimes, the consequences this has for forest health, and the options that are available for land managers to plan and adapt their forests now and in the future. I've also heard from Tom at the Melbourne Museum, and he's also come in to meet my students once, which is great. So over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Sorry, just took me a moment there to find the unmute button, and I will do the full share screen. Sorry, I might just redo that so you can see the proper one. 1 second. One moment. There we go. All right, you should be getting the right one there. All right, well, thank you for that introduction, and thanks for having me along to talk today. And obviously, as sort of the introduction there, I'm coming from a bit of a different background here when talking to you all, and coming more from the ecology, forestry, fire science sort of background. And so, yeah, just wanted to talk about some of the insights I've had, or what I've sort of experienced working in sort of previous roles of mine, and also just sort of what I'm observing in terms of some of the challenges that are being faced in, I guess, the native forest estate. So, you know, we're talking about public forests and sort of the areas predominantly to the east of Melbourne in the Victorian Alps. So, what I'll be focusing on is talking, I guess, a bit of a story about alpine ash in particular, and the impacts of the Black Summer bushfires as well as previous bushfires. So just make sure that all works. There we go. I guess just as and I'll try to cover a fair bit here, and I'm not sure of people's backgrounds, so I might cover some things that people are already aware of or not, but I just guess as a bit of a crash course in fire ecology for eucalypt forests in public forests and native forests. The real simple way you can divide eucalypt forests, and talking just about the overstory trees there, is their response to fire, which they've obviously evolved with over thousands and thousands of years. They've developed a range of mechanisms, and that's really helpful in being able to respond to fire, but also deal with pressures like drought. And yeah, very roughly, you can sort of divide eucalypt forests into two sort of broad kind of classes, and that's whether they resprout after they get burnt by a severe fire, or whether they die and regenerate from seed after a severe fire. So I've got some photos there of sort of that two sort of division there between the different forest types. And of course, you know, there's sometimes mixing between the two and all that. The example that I'm going to be talking about predominantly is what we call the obligate cedars or the ash forests. And these are the ones where when they get burned by a severe fire, they die, the mature trees die, and they release seed. And in a couple of slides, I'll go a little bit more into the ecology of that. But those forests you generally find in sort of more highly productive areas of the landscape. Now, these fire responses are generally a response to sort of what we call the fire regime, which is, I guess what you could say is sort of the usual range of fires that you get in a particular region. And that's usually governed by climate patterns, weather patterns, sort of all these sort of things that determine how fires burn in those landscapes. But the thing to note about this and the context that we're sitting in here is that over the last 20 years or so, we've had a large number of bushfires, and the main aspect of this is that it's resulted in the intervals between fires decreasing. So this is what we're looking at here. That graph on the right at the top there just shows the area that's burned in different fire seasons over the last 50 years or so. And what you can sort of pick out there, obviously, is that in the last 20 years or so, we've had 3 really large fires, which is over 1 million hectares in size. And then we've also had a range of, well, comparatively smaller fires, but still very large fires in that period too, including things like the Black Saturday bushfires of 2009 and a range of other fires as well. So just those stats there is that in that 20-year window of 2000 to 2020, we've had 6.2 million hectares of forest that has burned in total, whereas that's more than what burned in the previous 50 years. So that's just sort of to illustrate to say there's been a lot of fire, it's been happening much more frequently. Now, the consequence of this is that there's only so much land, so naturally you're going to start having instances where the fires run into areas that have burned within the last few years anyway. So we call them reburns. And this brings up this question around, well, what happens when these eucalypt forests go from being burnt once every couple of decades to being burnt potentially a few times in a decade? And this is a particular issue for ash eucalypts. Now I'm going to focus mainly on alpine ash, but mountain ash is sort of the other ash eucalypt that we talk about a lot. And ash eucalypts in general are very sort of iconic. I don't know how much time people in this forum here have spent out in forest, but ash eucalypts are sort of probably some of the most iconic forest types that you sort of see there. There's sort of if you go along the Black Spur outside of Hillsville, that's mountain ash forest there. So ash forests in general occur in the much higher productivity and higher rainfall parts of the landscape, and fire is generally frequent. As I've already gone through, they get killed by a high severity fire when that burns through. They don't have a lot of defensive mechanisms against it, like they don't really resprout well, and they have particularly thin bark. So when a summer bushfire occurs, it's actually also occurring in a time when those trees themselves have a lot of seed in the crowns of them, and so the fire induces that seed fall, and then you have this massive regeneration event. And that's just a diagram there of sort of, I guess this is sort of considered the traditional life cycle, I guess, of these forests. Now, the really important note about this is those regenerating trees, as they're regrowing after that major disturbance, and the big mature trees have all died, generally aren't really producing a reliable quantity of seed for maybe the first 15 to 20 years. This gets called the immaturity risk. And obviously, as this context that I've been talking about here, where you have lots of large fires happening and they're happening at short intervals, what is the risk is, and what happens is if a fire then burns into that forest as it's regenerating, the trees can't set seed and you effectively lose ash from that forest. Now, obviously, a forest is more than just the overstory trees. There's understory species and all those components, but these are sort of the large dominant parts of the landscape that kind of characterize, the carbon sequestration, habitat, those sort of things. So what does this look like when it happens? Now, obviously, any fire just after it's been burnt, any forest after it's been burnt by a severe fire is not going to look great. This is an aerial photo I took of alpine ash forest during the Black Summer bushfires, or after the Black Summer bushfires, only a few months after. And this is in the Victorian Alps. And what you can see there is basically, this is the process of that immaturity risk playing out. The white stems that you can see there is the former forest, so the previous mature forest that then got burned in the first fire. And the brownish sort of colouring you see there was the regenerating forest that then got burned before it had seed on it. So When this happens, it can actually happen in quite extensive parts of the landscape. And so if you're suddenly having those areas where you're no longer going to have an overstory trees of ash, it's got some quite serious consequences. So obviously, like I said, it looks particularly bad at this point. This is what it looks like a little bit further down the track. Those trees that you see growing in the foreground there are acacia species. So you're seeing a shift of the dominance of this community from a large, tall, open forest type to a more scrubby, wattle-dominated forest. And then if you give it more time, and this photo is from 1975 from Leon Kosterman's book, which is the field guide for Southeast Australia's forests. This is on the road to Lake Mountain, and this is what this patch of forest looked like. This used to be a tall alpine ash forest. You can see the stump there on the left of the picture. It got burned multiple times in the early 1900s and converted to this wattle forest here. And so that yellow colour there that you see is all the wattle sort of scrub. And you can see occasional emergent eucalypts there a little bit, but this is sort of that process playing out. And the main point of this is obviously there's those points there that I say. The reason to be concerned about this is there are still ecosystem services being provided here, but you do see obviously when this happens, you see a decline in the extent of ash forest. You're going to see a reduction in the amount of carbon storage, reduced habitat trees for possums and gliders and those sort of things. Obviously, loss in aesthetic values, it depends what sort of forest types you like, but you know, and erosion of water risk. So when this occurs, there's serious consequences associated, is basically what we're saying there. The Black Summer fires really added to this sort of issue in that because of all those large fires that had occurred in the early 2000s, when the Black Summer fires, which were over 1 million hectares in size, they then burned through all of that forest that had been burned since 2000, and it resulted in a situation where, and this is what this map on the right here shows, you're having more and more areas of the landscape that has been burned, even at high severity, multiple times in that short interval. So the result for ash forests in particular was that with alpine ash, it ended up being about 26,000 hectares of young ash was then burned at high severity, and so was identified as being at risk of regeneration failure. What I like to point out about this is not the first time this has happened in the last 20 years, but it's really the scale that this has happened at, which is really quite unprecedented. So that those bars there basically just show the amount of areas that previously that were at risk of collapse, and it's really been blown out of the water by the Black Summer fires. So what can be done about it? I was working for the Department of Environment when Black Summer happened, so we were aware of this being a particular issue, and I worked with a range of other people to assist with the implementation of a restoration or recovery program. And basically what this is that it's very well known you can recover alpine ash forests in these sort of circumstances, effectively by adopting practices that the forestry industry have used when they're recovering or regenerating areas that have been harvested for timber previously. Effectively, what it means is the fire's burned through, you have a suitable seed bed. If you put locally sourced seed out onto that landscape, then you're going to be able to get that seed back into landscape effectively and regenerate that forest. You have a really tight window that you need to do this in because alpine ash seed generally have a dormancy, which means that they need to be out basically so that they can sit on the ground over winter, have the dormancy broken, germinate, and basically be on the site before those areas start being outcompeted by regrowing vegetation of different species. So basically, between the fire finishing in February or March, and June or so, you've got to organise. And this was what was quite sort of confronting about this project. You had to organise a whole aerial sowing operation for as much as possible that could be recovered. So the Victorian government generally retains stocks of ash seed in seed banks, and it was found that there was enough seed in general after the fires to sow, in usual practices, probably about 5,000 hectares of alpine ash forest. Now, there was 25,000 hectares of alpine ash that was at risk of collapse. So you see there's a discrepancy there about how much could be restored versus how much was needing restoration. So some new approaches were undertaken where there was the use of lower sowing rates rather than the standard rates, using fixed wing aircraft to spread it further, and prioritising areas that were likely to be refugia. The result was, by adopting those changes, was that about 11,500 hectares of forest was able to be resown, which is a really good outcome. It was probably the biggest project that was ever done in the state like this, and pretty much exhausted the state's reserves of ash seed. And the result was that there's a pretty fairly comprehensive program now to collect as much ash seed as possible, so that there's preparation basically if this happens again, which it probably will. The point to sort of note there is that this was only just under half of the area that was at risk of collapse. So we have a lot of landscape out there that's going to go through a transition into effectively a different type of forest. And that is where I sort of want to go to here, which is where we're sort of getting more into that, looking into the future a little bit and thinking about things differently. And this is things that I think the forestry profession is sort of confronting a fair bit. So obviously, we know with climate projections and with the way things are looking, we're going to have more severe fire seasons in the future. So this restoration and recovery program was excellent, but it's not something that, you know, oh great, set and forget, we dealt with it in 2019-20, that we're not going to have to worry about it again. The, you know, slightly depressing thought is that those areas that were resown may very well burn again in the next 20 years. So this does start to bring up questions around, well, what do we mean when we're thinking about restoration? What are the natural sort of things that we're looking for here? Are we looking backwards to 1788 of we want to keep these ecological vegetation classes as they are, or are we thinking about how do you build resilience in so you have forest cover in the future? And the broader question as well is, when are we going in here and trying to manage this, and when do we say we have to walk away, we can't do this, we need to take a step back and let processes play out? Now, obviously, this is all really easy stuff to ask as questions, and finding answers for them is much more difficult. But the thing to note is that these questions aren't something that are just being faced, obviously, by the Victorians or people who manage ash forests in Southeast Australia. The US National Park Service is developing, or has developed, a framework called the RAD framework, or the Resist, Adapt and Direct framework, which sort of is thinking, well, land managers are going to have to be existing in a context of change with climate change. So how are you going to approach how you evaluate your management, and what are you going to be managing for? And effectively the RAD is about whether you're resisting, which means you're sort of trying to keep it as it was, whether you're directing it in a new direction, or whether you're accepting these changes as they're happening. In Southeast Australia, it's quite similar, but we use different terms, and this is sort of emerging stuff here, which is about planned mitigation versus autonomous adaptation and planned adaptation. And these are really used in the climate change context. And I suppose just to give a summary there, we deal a lot with the resist component, which is basically saying, well, we want to maintain these forest structures of what we know and what they are. And so that's like resowing with alpine ash, or we let areas go to scrub. And those areas where we're not able to, we do that and we let that happen. The planned adaptation thing is, I think, the point where we're sort of starting to grapple with and philosophically examine it more, which was we're saying, well, how are we directing, or do we direct, basically, is the question there. And in these ash type ecosystems, the direction, or that option to take would be, instead of sowing with alpine ash, you're sowing with different eucalypt species. So you resow with eucalypts that are able to resprout, and therefore they may be more resilient to those future fires. I guess the point is, that's the theory sort of thing. That's the potential path that you can take. We aren't doing that yet, and I don't think. I think there's a lot of sort of operationally, there's a lot of things that need to be done before we're even able to get to that point if we wanted to do it. But then again, there's also lots of, I guess, interdisciplinary philosophical questions that come up about taking that approach, because effectively it's guiding ecosystem change. But I suppose the point sort of to consider here is the change is already happening as well. So how do we communicate this? How do we deal with it as a community? And sort of the social context of it all are all really major questions. So I think I've highlighted there what's in my conclusions, and hopefully covered everything off there relatively quickly. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Tom. That was really great, really interesting stuff. We'll get to more questions at the end, I think. So Jeff Beavis is up next, and he is the Nursery Manager of ecoDynamics Nursery and has been growing plants for over 30 years. On his current role, Jeff is specifying and growing plants for highly modified urban environments, such as roadsides and storm water wetlands. These landscapes perform specific aesthetic or treatment functions and are constructed on highly modified urban environments. To successfully establish long-lived landscapes, Jeff chooses from a variety of plant palettes to build functional species lists. So in his talk, he will reflect on this approach and how we can apply it to urban landscapes in future as we respond to the pressures of development and a rapidly changing climate. Over to you, Jeff. Thanks.
Thanks, Brendon, and welcome everyone. I'll start by trying to share my screen. Okay, step one done. The landscapes that are built adjacent to new or expanded roads, freeways, and the associated areas around housing and estates and that, they need to be considered for what they are. They are actually constructed landscapes or built landscapes, and in reality, they bear very little resemblance to the landscape that was in place prior to that area being built. When we're doing that, we're actually not replacing or recreating the indigenous vegetation that was, when we're replacing or recreating the indigenous vegetation that's there are a number of factors that we need to consider to make sure that the landscape works. So it needs to be visually appealing without being distracting. You can't have anything too ornamental along the edge of a road because people might be driving off the road. And likewise, it needs to be just a background sort of there without being dead, dull and boring. So you need to make sure that people can focus on, if it's a roadway, that they're driving. The landscape needs to be self-sustaining and it needs to be fairly long-lived. And they also need to be self-maintaining, because once the landscape's handed over by the constructor or the developer or that sort of thing, there's often very little maintenance done to such environments. And particularly if you're working on the edge of a freeway or the edge of a railway line or that sort of thing, accessibility and getting in to actually look after the landscape can be problematic. With these factors here in mind, we think that there should be a much greater importance being placed on shrubs in these landscapes than there is at the moment on the regeneration of grasslands and tuftlands. Now, look, don't get me wrong, grasslands and tufting plants are an integral part of the landscape, and particularly out here in the west of Melbourne, they are or were the dominant landscape, and where they are remnant in areas, they need to be protected. But to put it along the edge of a freeway or a railway line is not the best place for this. They basically get overrun with weeds, as you can see here. In these areas, shrubs actually excel. And if you're choosing shrubs, they offer a great diversity. There is a large number of shrubs that fit the bill, so that will help to work the area. Each individual plant covers a significant area, and they're present in the environment at all times. They are not dependent upon grazing or burning regimes for regeneration. They grow equally well in all areas, whether it be jute matted areas, bare areas, mulch beds. And because each plant covers a large area, they restrict weed growth. As I said, you can have a huge diversity in shrubs. They come in a variety of sizes, from ground covers, such as your echinus, dichondras, all the way up to small trees like your Alocas littoralis Alicaz verticillata. There's a huge spectrum of colours in foliage, from the greys of the salt bushes and westringias all the way through the greens of goodenias to the lush dark greens of euchoryeas. And they have a variety of flower colours and flowering seasons, so there can always be something of interest in the landscape. Because they cover a significant area, an important factor when you're designing these things is you require less plants per square metre, which is a cost deterrent. You can get away with using two to 4 shrubs per metre instead of the 6 to 8 per metre if you're using tufting or grass type plants. So there's a significant cost saving there. And just look at that. That's a shrub landscape that's been installed alongside a freeway. There's 4 or 5 different greens. There's very little open area and there's very little weed showing through. As I said, our indigenous shrubs, they're in the environment all the time. They don't need grazing or fire regimes to regenerate, and they don't have fire avoidance mechanisms in such that they die off or disappear over the hotter months of the year. So they're there full time, covering the ground. The full foliage cover, as well as reducing weeds, reduces the effect of runoff. The foliage acts as like an umbrella and it slows down the penetration of the water. You get less erosion, you get better penetration of the rain into the environment. And so you've got less runoff running down into the marine environment and other areas. And it's not taking any of the other associated chemicals and affecting areas downstream from the location. And large shrubs can also provide areas of shade, which in urban areas, which are prevalent out here in the West, they're great at offsetting the heat that is generated by all the concrete and asphalt and bitumen and that sort of thing. And shrubs grow equally well, whether they're in a garden bed, whether they're in jute mat on the edge of a stream channel or that sort of thing, or in a bare area. The shrubs tend to grow together well and cover the ground, as you can see here. So they actually block out the light. They reduce the amount of light that's available for it, and they form like an umbrella effect, which actually repels a lot of the weed seeds. So weed seeds that might be blowing around in the environment don't actually land on the soil when you've got large areas of shrubs. Whereas when you've got large areas of grasses or tufts or that sort of thing, they actually tend to act a little bit like a sign or that sort of thing. A weed seed will blow along, it'll hit a piece of the grass or the foliage, it'll run down the leaf and land in the clump and that sort of thing. And there's a humidity there, there's a little bit of substrate there, and the weeds actually take off and grow more rapidly and establish quicker in those areas than they do in areas where they're shed and not even touching the ground. Shrub landscapes are often thought of as large areas of a single species, like the slides that are up there now. They don't need to be that. They don't need to be a monoculture. That they can be like this. If you see there, this is a road freeway side that was put in South Australia. This one here, you can see the trees, the couple of trees and taller shrubs starting to come through, but there's about 30 or 40 different species through here, variety of foliage types, variety of foliage colours, and that sort of thing. It's showing that you can get good ground coverage, you've still got really good variety. And this landscape here is only 2 to 3 years old maximum. So really rapid establishment and ground coverage. So not a lot of weed or that to go in, which really reduces your maintenance cost. You're not needing to block lanes, shut down roads, that sort of thing, to keep the environment looking good. And as I said, they restrict the weed growth. They work together to reduce the opportunity for weed seeds to land and germinate by keeping them off the ground and not giving them areas to go into. The general habit of the shrub means that the seed's actually captured in the foliage, or it's shed off into another area adjacent to it. Very often hard stand or that sort of thing on these sort of areas where the seed won't actually grow. We're talking a lot about climate adaptation, and there is no reason why a lot of the plants that are present in similar climates in southwest of Western Australia, the Adelaide Hills and that, can't work very well. This slide here is a picture of a woody meadow that was put in by Melbourne University at Birrarungma. It is 4 years old, and is a mixture of local Indigenous plants and Western Australian plants, and it is thriving. It's got the advantage of using some of the Western Australian plants is they are more floriferous and they tend to flower at slightly different times of the year from our Victorian plants. They are better adapted to periods of hot, dry weather. They tolerate the cold and wet and miserable conditions that we've got now equally well. And it's just going to climate proof what we do into the future to make sure the landscape is long lived and exists. And it adds to the visual amenity of the landscape. Likewise, a lot of breeders around about are working on varieties of local plants as well as Western Australian plants that have a tighter, more compact foliage form. And that fits right into the area of filling over the ground and covering it up and making sure that there's working with weed suppression, reducing the amount of runoff when we get the heavy rain periods and that sort of thing. But the advantage of these plants that have been bred specifically is that they have a longer flowering period, they are low maintenance, and just because they weren't here 200 years ago doesn't mean they shouldn't be considered in landscapes for the future. And we as plant growers, architects, and landscape constructors, we all have a responsibility to ensure that the environments that we build and the landscapes that we construct today are visually agreeable, and they've got to be sustainable. They've got to be sustainable climatically, so that they will cope with the changes in the climate as it comes. Though sitting here in Melbourne today, it's hard to believe that we are in a warming climate. They must be sustainable ecologically, in that we don't want to be bringing in plants that are going to take over and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of work. Melbourne University in particular have done a lot of work with how West Australian plants have grown in here and that they haven't self-seeded and run away and that sort of thing. And they've got to be sustainable financially. There is very little money for maintenance of landscapes. So once we put it in and get it established, it's got to be able to look after itself. And we think that shrubs fit the bill on all of those characteristics, and they deserve a little bit more credit than what they've been given historically in built landscapes. So yeah, that's my ode to shrubs. Some of my favourite plants are shrubs, so I'm probably a little bit biased, but yeah, that's it. If anyone's got any questions, happy to answer them at the end of the session.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff. All really interesting stuff. Again, we will, if you have questions, please insert it into the Q&A section. So up next, we have John Fitzgibbon, who is the owner of Metro Trees, a 24-year-old nursery which grows high-quality trees for councils, public authorities, landscapers, and developers through southeastern Australia. Metro Trees specialise in the production of suitable species and selections for streetscapes and other public open spaces. So in his talk, John will drill down on 5 new climate-ready species suitable for the built environment. Over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Very interesting talks, Tom and Jeff. I love a good shrubs are a fantastic plant. I'm not growing enough. I probably need to talk to you and ask you what I should be growing to more advanced sizes, Jeff. And Tom, years ago, I used to collect eucalypt seed up behind Dargo, working around the loggers, and that was quite an experience. But you know, collecting that ash seed was quite something. Excuse me as I just share my presentation. Well, thank you, Brendan and AILA Vic and the Environmental Committee for allowing us Metro Trees to share again. Today I'm talking about specific trees that'll be suitable for a shifting climate or changing climate. I've got time today to go through roughly 3, and I'll just recap on some of the information that we provided in the last Environmental Committee presentation. So my topic is more about trees. It's more about the families, the diversity in our urban forest to protect it from pest and disease, from specific climate events that could be problematic. Dr. Frank Santamore wrote a paper on diversity, and that we should not have more than 10% of any one species, 20% of any one particular genus, and 30% of one particular family in our urban streetscape populations for the fact of resilience and sustainability, as Jeff mentioned. It's really important to have that variety. So if something did come to knock out a particular species or genus within the tree population, that we would still have coverage in many of our streets, and that we wouldn't have too much of an issue replenishing those that had failed due to unforeseen circumstances. So we're going to think 30 or 40 years into the future as these trees mature. They've got to be able to take the conditions that we're predicting. At the moment, the west and north of Melbourne looks like it's going to be more like the outskirts of Bathurst in New South Wales. So we start to need to think about what we're growing and how they're going to deal with the conditions. So we can look at other climate analogues around the world, or homoclimes, to where Bathurst climate will be, and then we can make some decisions about what particular genomes we should be using in our streetscapes. So it opens up a whole plethora of new material, which is great. It's a bit challenging for the nurseryman because we've got to learn how to grow them and make them economical in containers. But anyway, we're starting the process. So at Metro Trees, we've been modifying our stock list for quite a while, and we're looking at bringing new particular potential trees in via trials. A lot of local councils have their own set lists of material that they're using, and that is what goes on the landscape architect list to what can be used. They're starting to trial new material. So hopefully some of this new material, once it's proven over the next few years, might start popping up on the lists, and then you should be able to buy them from your nurseries. So for quite a while, we've been working on just getting rid of trees in our group of plants in the nursery, in our particular nursery, that are poor tolerant or not tolerant to heat. And we're trying to really build up that diversity and familial level, which means the families. I might just put my pointer on. So we're trying to, really extend the different families available. So looking at Australia and particular ecotypes or homoclimes or climate analogues, we find that this area in Western Australia, the goldfields area of that area below Kalgoorlie and above Esperance and Denmark, is quite a useful area for eucalypts that would do well in the north and west of Melbourne specifically. As you know, you would think that the east of Melbourne will be wetter and cooler than the north and west, so we can use more of our current selections of trees because you will have the moisture and potentially lower heat compared to the north and west of Melbourne. So I'm thinking quite Melbourne centric when I provide this presentation. The other area to look at is around the areas of between Brisbane and Toowoomba, back down into Casino, Lismore, where there is material in, say, rain shadow areas that are more rainforest-like material, or Gondwan and old Gondwan type, up in the along the divide, that could be quite, well, can be quite useful. Some that are already proving to be very useful already in our suite of trees or a bag of trips. The other area is up behind Cairns. So up in the Atherton tablelands, there's some drier areas up there and it gets quite cold too. So these plants can also be used in Melbourne, and we can actually diversify the families that we're using. This is a slide of a gentleman's rainforest planting halfway between Brisbane and Toowoomba. So he's sort of in a rain shadow area, just probably 30 k's from Ipswich. When the Wivenhoe Dam came in, it actually reduced his average rainfall per annum, and he was down to around 300 millimetres a year. So this planting is quite useful. He gets down to about -4 degrees Celsius and gets up towards 40 degrees Celsius. So the temperature range and the actual reduced rainfall tells us that some of this material could be quite valuable in Melbourne. Obviously, recently he's been inundated with water with a lot of the high levels of rainfall, but that's a bit of an anomaly. He'll go back to drier conditions again. But some of this material will give us new, greater diversity in genus and family to be used in our open spaces and trees, large gardens, even small gardens. Some of them are small plants. So this particular plant, Alphitonia excelsa, the red ash, it's a very attractive plant. It sort of grows across the top end. It can take low temperatures, it can take high heat, it can take drought. This one's in the Wade Arboretum in Adelaide, which is a good comparator, or helps with estimating where Melbourne might be. It's probably a little bit moister and not as hot as what we will become, but at least there's a bit of a stepping process until we get to that point in 20 to 30 years time, that some of this material could be quite useful in our landscapes. So this one's part of the Rhamnaceae family, which the Rhamnaceae is not overly represented in our streetscape populations or in general in our landscapes. So it gives you that diversity. As you can see, the foliage is quite beautiful. The bark is actually a very attractive grey and it's very tight. So it's not an ugly tree, and it's not a huge tree either. I think in Melbourne, although it can grow bigger in its own ecotype, so I think in Melbourne probably around 8 metres high by 6 to 7 metres wide. At the moment, it's growing quite well in the nursery at Sylvan. It's probably a little bit slow, but as we get hotter, it will be something that will be more commercially valuable. I threw Eucalyptus boreana in. It's one that a lot of you would already be specifying in your landscape plans, but I thought the blue box, obviously it's Myrtaceae. Myrtaceae is overrepresented in our populations, but it is a family that's extremely useful. Thinking back to Jeff's presentation from the previous Environmental Committee presentation, he mentioned bringing ecotypes from further north and mixing them into the populations of some of the southern ecotypes. And this would also would be something good with Eucalyptus boreana. So this can be grown as a tree, or it can be a malleeform. So it's quite useful in a sense with the mallees, where you haven't got a lot of root plate or available root space. It might be a valuable thing to put multiples in where you can actually manage and cut them back over time, because they have adapted to be cut back to more of a copse and a reshoot. But this is quite a handsome tree. This is at the Melbourne Botanic Gardens. It's semi-mature. It's not mature as yet. Obviously, they can get quite large. But it's got good heat, moderate drought, but maybe some of the ecotypes that we could look at may be more drought tolerant and very tolerant to frost. And moving along to more of an international selection with the oaks. At the moment, we're using a lot of oaks that like the Quercus rubras, Albas, palustris, that need a lot more water. Obviously, they're deciduous that I've just mentioned, but this one's Emorii, so it's quite a glabrous, shiny looking oak. I think I chose the slide because I very much like the plant, and it can get to a sort of a medium-sized tree. Anyway, it's some of the ecotypes where it comes from is Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and North Mexico. And some of these areas can be quite dry and harsh. So why not bring these into our populations? We've got the Quercus canariensis, we've got Roba, which are virtually evergreen. We've got Ilex, which this one looks at. Brendon thought it looked very Ilex-like. It is similar and one of the evergreen oaks, but it's got a lush, that leaf lamina is a lot larger. The bottom sides of the leaves are very glossy as well, which is quite attractive, but obviously you can't see it from a distance. But these are all quite valuable plants that could be used into the future. There are other oaks, there's like Quercus cambii and lacei. They're useful in fire areas around buildings because they're not calorific, they won't explode like eucalypts or olives, those sorts of things that have got high calories that can be quite flammable. But anyway, worthy components of a new landscape. And we're at Metro Trees, we're working on a few other things, a lot of deciduous trees from international sources. We're looking at the taxodiums, migranatum, where you've got a wetter area and you need to have, you know, relatively high heat tolerance would be useful. Also the elms. We've got one of the Ulmus triumph coming through our system, which is a UC Davis, California selection, which is more elm leaf beetle resistant and DD resistant. And this is a shot of Alphington before we'd moved to Sylvan. So we've been at Sylvan for the last 5 years. And we're just building up our stock inventory and our site with infrastructure. This is an old shot of Alphington, central Melbourne, where we were growing on a 2-acre site. And you can see the diversity of plants that we've got growing, which is sort of representation of, you know, what we need in the urban landscape, just to prevent catastrophic tree failure. Anyway, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. That was really interesting stuff. I was just going to add as well, Tom responded to you in chat and he said, So there's plenty of work seed collecting still going on if you'd like to revisit your early years.
I was lucky to survive it because I was working around the loggers, and they sometimes they drop a tree in. So yeah, no, I'm probably lucky to still be here. But yeah, thanks, Tom. It was quite well paid, put it that way.
Very good. Thank you very much, John. That was great. There's a fair few questions I have to get through, and I'm just going to jump around a little bit between the chat and the Q&A. So I think I might just go in order. So I might just get Tom up first, and I'll just fire a few questions to you. Tom, I thought I might actually just throw a quick curveball and say I might put up a picture on the screen, and you may want to talk to it for a moment.
Depends what picture it is. Oh, yep, I know that picture.
I just thought it was a good one that you wrapped up with last time I heard from you, and I thought it's a nice thing to mention.
Yes, so that's the black spur that probably everyone has driven along at some point. Brendan, the point I probably should have made it in my slides, but this was an area that was burned a couple of times. Not the whole area of the black spur, but in the early 20th century as well. And if you go to Fernshaw, which is the little picnic ground, the area just up the road from that was actually burned multiple times in the early 20th century and was replanted. So I think it's a nice little, well, it's a good story in a way, because everyone drives through there and thinks how beautiful it looks, but if you get to certain points, sometimes you can actually see some areas are a bit more in lines than others, and I think that was the result of people following, straight line and planting them. So yeah.
Very good. I like that story. It's very good. All right, so question time. So first one is, thanks for your research. This is from Perry. It's very interesting stuff. Given fire-resistant tree species are also quite pyrophilic, they encourage fire as well as resist it. Could replanting with these species make the situation worse for remaining pockets of ash?
Yeah, well, that's and I think that was a question that came up a fair bit in those sort of months after the Black Summer fires as well around these areas. Was what are the consequences for sort of the fuel as well if you're replanting with different species, and exactly that, particularly if you're going with stringy bark species or anything like that, which can obviously have different dynamics. But I mean, then again, there are resprouters that have more gum bark as well, so that might change that aspect. It's a really complicated one. I mean, I guess in not putting eucalypts back in the landscape, obviously eucalypts have their own, they're certain, their leaves are great at bursting into flame, but I guess some with that shift to a really understory dominated by maybe wattles, that can also be quite flammable as well. So it's sort of, it's one of those things where there's no necessarily ideal outcome. You're sort of going to have to really weigh up the different ones and different approaches and sort of think, well, what's kind of the main aim here that you're wanting to go for? And yeah, it's tricky. It's definitely tricky. I don't think I gave a clear answer there, but yeah.
Right, the next one is, so can you talk to the balance between vegetation retention and addition within areas with the bushfire attack level rating of 29 or above? It's an interesting challenge in approvals process presently in retaining vegetation within defendable space. And this is from Matt.
So is that's in reference to the reseeding sort of stuff, was it? Or yeah, yes. Must be. Yeah. I guess, well, that hasn't come up a huge amount, I suppose, mainly because a lot of these areas that we're talking about where reseeding is occurring is pretty deep in sort of public land estate where you're sort of maybe not having as much of an impact on adjacent communities as much, and therefore the relationships to sort of the BAL. But yeah, look, it's a complicated one, because then I think the Black Summer fires inspired a fair bit of research coming out of this, is looking at different threats to obligate cedars and all that sort of stuff. And I think one part that needs to be put over that is, yeah, how do you sort of mix that in with communities that might be in, tall ash forests or something like that, and how does that relate to their safety versus aesthetics, all those sort of things. It's yeah, I feel like my answer is usually going to be, it's complicated. which I know is not helpful, but it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but yeah.
And I have another final question for you, and it's another one that may have a similar response, but this is in regards to the involvement of traditional land management techniques and philosophies in the assistance of, I guess, a transitioning landscape in terms of those future climate trends. What is your opinion of that in that area?
Yeah, look, again, after the Black Summer fires, I think there's been a lot of really great sort of work that's come out looking at the role of traditional owner land management and discussions around, particularly if you get it, I don't know if people have read, but if you get a chance to look up Michael Fletcher's work, who is from University of Melbourne, he's been involved with some really interesting work around bringing in that longer term perspective of how vegetation has changed essentially since colonisation potentially in some areas. And he's got a great example from Tasmania, where a patch of area that's rainforest now, if you go into the pollen record, was actually grassland at the time of European colonisation. And it's just sort of the result of the cessation of cultural burning in that landscape that's allowed rainforest to essentially prosper, which, you know, we sort of think of rainforest as this Gondwanan species that's been around forever in areas. And so I think that's just that's a great sort of way to think about the shift over time. So I guess that's a way to sort of go around to say, I think bringing traditional owners and cultural burning and those sort of things it's well overdue. It's really happening a lot now, which is really great. One book I really recommend to potentially read if people haven't read it is Fire Country by Victor Stephenson. It's excellent because it goes through talking about cultural fire as a tool, but then talks about applying it in the landscape, applies it in areas where you wouldn't burn, applies it in areas where you would burn, what time you'd burn it, all these sort of things that you learn. So, you know, the ash forests, would that be, you know, that they may not be burnt, you know, in that sort of regime, but it might be the adjacent areas. And so burning in the sort of drier forests that are next door might be a part of a cultural burning program, which then maybe helps protect the vulnerable ash forests when they're regrowing. I mean, I'm not prescribing anything, but I really recommend sort of, you know, yeah, it's great to see that being elevated as it is now. And I think it's going to be a really important tool over the next decades that we need to learn a lot from.
Great answer. Thanks, Tom. All right, we'll move on to Jeff. So Jeff, can you please talk to the lifespan of shrub mass landscapes? And in Alex's experience, he's had, they always try to include long-lived species, as shrubs only tend to last 10 to 20 years.
I was targeting a lot of my speech at talk about around roadways and roadsides and that sort of thing, with particular reference to a metropolitan area. And in Melbourne anyway, most of our major roads are ripped up every 10 to 15 years anyway, so, and redone. So it's not as much of an issue with that. A combination of trees with long-lived shrubs, a lot of your salt bushes, some of your correas, your gardenias, all those things will all drop seed. And if there's an opening, will self-seed and come back through and perpetuate that way. So yes, they're not as long-lived as trees or Tom's forests or that sort of thing, but in a built environment, it doesn't live that long anyway.
Great, thank you. A question from me actually to Jeff as well. So when thinking about a predominantly shrubby landscape, what would you recommend in terms of install sizes and densities? Given some of these areas are constrained in access, what would you specify to ensure establishment success?
2 to 4 from tube stock. And really, the establishment is dependent upon the preparation of the ground. If the ground is prepared properly, the subsoil is ripped, you've got good topsoil on there, these things will take off and grow very quickly and establish very well.
Great, thank you. And one last question, I'll hand over to John now. Thanks, Jeff. So from Catherine, How does the soil in Western Australia compare to Melbourne? I always thought sandier. Do we need to consider soil drainage?
That's a good point. Yeah, look, in general, it's a lot more sandier in WA, and there's different sand types with different particle sizes. Some are sharp sands, some are round sands, but yeah, we do. Well, it depends on which part of Melbourne we're talking. If you're Bayside, you're going to be in sands. If you're further north or west, you're generally in clays. I guess drainage is obviously needed, or just correct planting technique is really important if that's what you mean. So in a lot of cases, you might want to plant a little bit higher. You don't want to be actually sitting trees in a sump where water can actually sit underneath them. I hope that answers it. Yes, the soils are different. Redrainage, well, where you can drain and you've got a heavier soil type with a clay soil layer or close to the surface soil layer, well, yes, that would be advantageous.
And John, I saw you had a question for Jeff. Do you want to just ask it out loud?
Yeah, sure. Jeff, James Hitchmore, he's obviously flicks out to Australia quite a bit. So with these shrub concepts for larger open space planting, is it similar to what he's discussing with the chef planting technique or selection?
Similar, but slightly, but probably different, John. It's the same basic premise, yeah, not quite the same densities as what he's working at. Right. You can increase the density with shrubs quite easily up to 10 to 12 per metre if you want to, but 2 to 3 years down the track, you have essentially, for want of a better term, wasted a lot of your money on those extra plants, because the more aggressive ones will outcompete the slower ones and that sort of thing, and they'll just interact and you'll get natural attrition sort of thing. Whereas if you work at the 2 to 4 per metre, we've found that the 2 per metre with the taller shrubs, your Dodoneas, your smaller growing acacias, your leptospermums, that sort of thing, down to your 4s for your smaller correas, gardenias, those sort of lines. It works really, really, really well.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. So I will just start to wrap up. So